Tamatha Paul.
Speaker. I'm really disappointed that the Minister took 3 minutes to talk about such a significant piece of legislation that impacts tens of thousands of people who are in the custody of corrections. And that's just an example of why we can't and have not supported this bill throughout the entire process. I'm going to talk first broadly about prisons in Aotearoa, and then I'm going to move on to some specific issues that we've raised throughout this process. Our fundamental issue with the approach to this bill is that prisons have become the default answer to so many societal problems in New Zealand. They have become a response to poverty, to mental health and addiction issues, to neurological and behavioural problems, to intergenerational trauma. We take people with the greatest need and the least support, the least opportunity in life, and we throw them into concrete cages where they are completely forgotten about in society. Prisons are not only expensive, but they're ineffective, and they do not make our communities any safer. An overwhelming number of people are rotting in prison because they are poor and because they are vulnerable. Yes, there are some people in prisons who have caused significant harm, but because our prisons are designed to punish rather than to rehabilitate, we often entrench those harmful behaviours. When you look at the poverty that is being fuelled by this government, cuts to public health care, public education, a lack of job opportunities, cuts to benefits, it's no surprise that people make poor decisions when they don't have the right support or are trying to survive. Too often, people end up in prison simply for the crime of being poor, or the crime of being Māori, or the crime of being disabled. Any social worker or organisation that actually works with people in prison will tell you that. Locking people up after a crime has happened is no service to victims. It only creates future victims. A service to victims would be addressing the drivers of crime so that it doesn't even happen in the first place. So the first obvious thing that this bill does is it removes the treaty provisions that were put into this bill as it was being developed, which is a shame because we know that Māori are overrepresented in our prisons, and it is a national shame. We all know the statistics that despite the fact that Māori only make up 17% of the general population, that they make up half of the male prison population, 2/3 of the women's prison population, and 2/3 of those in youth justice residences. There were treaty provisions inserted into the bill to try and address this overrepresentation. It would have required corrections to have a strategy to reduce Māori overrepresentation. And it would have required corrections to make sure that Māori in prison have equitable access to rehabilitation and reintegration and cultural activities, regardless of which prisons they are in. These treaty provisions were taken out not because of the merits of those provisions, but because of the coalition agreement, because the government chose to anticipate what they knew would happen. That's not even a reasonable grounds to remove something so significant. And then corrections advisors were in support of taking out the treaty provisions, saying they felt that they were doing a good job for Māori. Clearly not when you look at the numbers. And during the committee of the whole house phase of this bill, I tried to put those treaty provisions back into the bill, but it was voted down by the government. Again, not because it has anything to do with corrections or anything to do with the people in prisons, but because of an ideological commitment to erasing Te Tiriti o Waitangi and over 40 pieces of legislation. And I'm not saying that treaty provisions being in the Corrections Act would fix everything overnight, but I am saying that it would at least represent a genuine and sincere commitment by corrections to address the gross and unfair overrepresentation of Māori in our prisons. And now all we have is an expired Hōkairangi strategy, which means nothing at the end of this year, and no formal commitment by corrections to honouring Te Tiriti or addressing Māori overrepresentation in prisons. Which leads me to my next point about solitary confinement. One of the recommendations during the submissions were that we looked into ending the use of one of the cruelest and harshest tools available to corrections, which is the use of solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is the practice of socially and physically isolating a person in conditions of confinement for 22 to 24 hours per day. International conventions say that solitary confinement should never be used for more than 15 days in a row. But we know, thanks to a report by the Auckland Extreme Risk Unit, that some prisoners have spent over 900 days in solitary confinement in Auckland prison. Solitary confinement isn't good for people who are in the cell or the people who have to manage that person in the cell. It heightens risk and animosity, and it completely undermines the effectiveness of rehabilitation. It's long overdue that we end the barbaric use of solitary confinement within our prisons. And on to the use of weapons. The final point that we want to make about this bill is on the use of weapons in our prison. This bill makes changes to the references to non-lethal weapons and changes it to less than lethal, and it sets out a process by which the minister can say yes or no to different weapons being used within prisons. This raises real concerns for us because one of the thresholds for the minister to approve weapons is whether it undermines the humane treatment, human rights or dignity of the people in prison. And I'm not sure that the minister has those things at heart, as reflected in his 3-minute speech. We're calling for a ban on weapons in prison that are currently used that are completely violent and destructive. Specifically, we're talking about the cell-buster pepper spray and the use of spit hoods. Cell-buster pepper spray is used by putting a canister under the door of a cell and effectively gassing a person in prison. This was shown in the Karma versus Cripps Attorney General case when an asthmatic woman in Auckland Women's Prison was gassed using this pepper spray. And spit hoods, the Ombudsman has been calling for an end to the use of those for people who are mentally vulnerable or young, and we're calling for a complete stop to the use, ban to the use of spit hoods, as has been done in Australia, in South Australia, and in New South Wales, because of the risk that they can be used incorrectly and the risk that they cause to asphyxiation and suffocation of the person that it has been used on. And at the end of the day, this all comes back to the way that we treat people while they are in our custody. When you recognise that a significant amount of people who are in prison are going to come back into society at some point, the way that we treat them while they are in our custody is of the utmost importance. Because if you teach people that violence is okay, when they come back out into the community, they will use violence because it's been reinforced to them by prison guards, by the state, by the people that they're with in prison, that violence is okay. Humiliation and punishment undermines the ability for rehabilitation to be successful or for people to even accept the support that they need to turn their lives around. To summarise that, if you treat people like animals, don't be surprised when they act like animals. The final points I want to make on this bill is that on mixing of accused and sentenced prisoners, the fact that the remand prison population will soon quickly overtake the sentenced population is a reflection that it is too hard for people to make bail. There are too many people in our prisons and on remand because they don't have a bail addressed, most likely because they don't even have a home or because it has become more difficult to get bail. A review of the Bail Act is needed. The mixing of youth and adult prison populations is also deeply concerning. This really reinforces the belief that there is a pipeline from the cradle to the grave within the justice system, from birth to state care to prison and endless cycles of recidivism. Putting young people and adults with prison, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that that is a recipe for disaster. So for all of these reasons and many more, we oppose this Corrections Amendment Bill. Kia ora.